Welcome to Everyday Martial Artist, a weekly podcast where you'll join me, Brian Doucette, as I interview a different martial artist each episode and hear their story. Some guests you may have heard of, and some you probably haven't. Be sure to subscribe where all your favorite podcasts are available. Also visit our website at everydaymartialartist.com. If you're listening for a specific interview, I sure hope you'll stay and check out the other episodes. A very special thank you to Topher Williams for our custom theme music. And now, the newest episode of Everyday Martial Artist. Everyday Martial Artist is brought to you by KOOnline.com for all your martial arts needs. Sparring and safety gear, rank belts, uniforms, weapons, patches, and more. Wholesale supplies made by martial artists for martial artists. Visit us today at ko-online.com. Hello and welcome to Everyday Martial Artist. I'm your host, Brian Doucette, and as we do every week, we're joined by a brand new guest talking about their life and their journey throughout the world of martial arts and sometimes other stuff they're involved in. My guest today is a content strategist, a book coach, a ghostwriter, and a men's coach. He's been studying martial arts for over 30 years and is also an ordained Zen priest. He is also the author of 5 books, including The Heart of Zen and When the Buddha Needs Therapy. He's also a frequent contributor to integrallife.com and the founder of Integrated Martial Arts in Boulder, Colorado. Please welcome my guest today, Mr. Keith Martin Smith. How you doing today, sir?
I'm doing great, Brian. Honored to be here.
Hey, I appreciate your time. I know we've been chatting back and forth for probably about 5 months or so.
It's been forever, yeah.
Yeah, it's all good. I'm glad we're finally doing it. So, but what I like to do with all my guests, I want to go back to the very beginning. I want to know where that first interest came from, that first spark that kicked off your interest in martial arts.
Yeah, well, for me, like a lot of people born in the 70s, the 80s were really an era of Karate Kid and a proliferation of karate schools. And so like lots of kids, I joined, I think it was Kempo, the American Karate Studio. Parker, I think the guy's name was. I can't remember.
Ed Parker,
now.
Okay.
Ed Parker,
cool.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so I was taking that and I took it for, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years, was like a green belt. And was just sort of fooling around with a friend's friend doing a little sort of, sparring and that kind of thing, who was a Northern Shaolin practitioner. Mm-hmm. And I'd been training for 5-6 years. He'd been training for about maybe 9 months, 12 months. And he just schooled me. I mean, just schooled me. It was humiliating and fascinating. And I didn't even know what Kung Fu was. I didn't know what the two words meant together. So it made me really curious about this different system. And so when I was about 20 years old, I found sort of a local Shaolin school under an Iron Palm master named Brian Gray, who was largely self-taught, but a good introduction to the system. And so I made the switch from American karate to Chinese Kung Fu and never looked back.
When you first got involved in the Kempo karate style, did you ever do the competition part of martial arts?
I didn't start doing competitions until I was in my 20s. So really not until, the American karate system had a lot of sparring in there as part of their schools. Yep. So I think we sparred like twice a week or something like that. I mean, it was pretty sparring centric.
Yeah.
So yeah, but then when I got in my 20s, I began competing in large tournaments on the east, up and down the East Coast.
Okay. So now you said you did the karate for about 5 to 6 years. So that's a pretty good base of a system. So after doing it that long, what are some of the first things that stood out when you think about maybe your first 2-3 Kung Fu classes? What were some of the really things that stood out that were, wow, this is so much different than I've been doing it?
I think the main thing was it was so circulinear as opposed to linear. The Chinese systems really use some circular things, some linear things, but a lot of the moves really, from Bagua to Xinyi to Tai Chi to Northern and Southern Shaolin, to the Manist styles and, sort of all over the place. The Chinese systems do not use as much linearity. And so I was really struck by that aspect of it. And the idea of, instead of fighting in a straight line, sort of in a grid, if you will, fighting inside of a circle. Okay. And so I immediately found it applicable, and it made me a better fighter because I was already trained to fight in a grid. So it was just basically learning to fight and train in a different kind of way. The additional element for the thing that really sort of got my attention in the Chinese system was the beginning of the introduction of iron body training, which I had not been introduced to at all in the American system. And as I mentioned, Brian Gray was an Iron Palm master, and I think he was on the cover of Inside Kung Fu a couple of times. And he could really do extraordinary demonstrations with breaking capacities. I mean, he could lay his palm flat on a 4 inches of concrete and roll it around and shatter all the concrete and just do all these things that look like magic tricks. And he was adamant that he wasn't doing anything special or magical, that it was just training and essentially breath and body mechanics combined.
Okay. Just a little bit more about the Kempo, then I'll definitely want to get back in there. Think back to maybe your first 5-6 Kempo classes. What was it about it that made you want, I mean, you joined, obviously you wanted to join, but what was it about you that made you want to stick with it, made you want to keep going for 5 to 6 years until you found another style that you wanted more?
Yeah. Well, I think there was this guy named Mark Lawler. It's funny. I still remember his name. He was like jet black hair, sort of stringy mustache. And he was just a badass. He was a black belt. He wasn't one of the highest ranking black belts in the school where I went, but he was a vicious and capable fighter, amazing timing, really powerful. And that school, again, we're talking the 80s. So that school had a lot of Vietnam veterans that were in their, gosh, how would they have been? Maybe their 40s at the time, which, I was like 14. So they seemed, like doddering old men at 45, but the things they could do with their bodies. So I think I was just drawn in by the toughness of it.
Okay. And
by it had sort of an unapologetically combat oriented framework that I really appreciated. So it didn't feel like fancy dancing. It was like, it was really about how to strike, how to kick, how to incapacitate an opponent. I mean, people got their ribs broken all the time in the school. It was a no BS kind of place. And that really appealed to me.
Do you think, thinking back, or maybe you thought about it then, but when you switched schools, did you take any of that with you and blend it into your Kung Fu, or were you a complete blank slate and relearned the way to do martial arts?
I completely relearned. I was young enough, because the differences in the systems are, in some ways they're minor if you're just looking at, the front stance in the Japanese system versus the front stance in the Northern system and in the Chinese system. But they're really different. The hips are really differently placed. The foot is differently placed. The mechanics of the body are quite different. And then the implications for how you move into striking and into adaptation to fighting is actually quite different.
So thinking back now with 30 years of experience, do you think having that background in a different style made it harder for you or easier for you to join that new school?
I think it was easier because I had something to contrast it with. And, I've continued, over the years. I mean, I've studied mostly in the Northern systems, but I've cross-trained in Krav Maga, I've cross-trained in Muay Thai, Jiu-Jitsu, grappling. What I think what that taught me, this was obviously long before the MMA had come about, but I sort of realized that it was good to have more tools in my toolbox than a single system. And I think that was what, like when I joined that school, even as a novice, I had 6 years under my belt, which meant I could kick really hard. I could strike really hard. Like I had all my mechanics were nailed, and then learning it into a system, and then really, taking that system for a long time, and then really wanting to begin to bring in, for me, more practical fighting elements, which led me to go into those other disciplines that I just mentioned.
And how long were you involved in the Kung Fu before you got into the competition side?
I started in my mid-20s, and I fought in tournaments, from about 25 up until about maybe 33 or so years old. Okay. So, yeah. So what is that, 8 years, give or take?
What do you think drew you to the competition?
Well, I wanted to win.
Nice.
We very much had a philosophy of, when we were called to spar, we would run out there. We wouldn't walk. And the moment they said go, we went. And so there was a real aggressive mindset, it was never about beating the crap out of somebody. All the schools that I was involved with very much had a much more pacifistic. It was about really mastering yourself, really mastering the art, and not dominating somebody, but I would say handily winning, so that you did not want to lose in front of your schoolmates, and you didn't want to shame your school and shame your master. So there was a strong incentive to always get first place unless you were fighting someone from your own school who was a higher rank. And then there was a strong incentive to get second place.
Nice. I like that. So do you remember your very first tournament?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Very well.
Talk about that a little bit. What was that experience like?
Yeah. So it was in DC, and gosh, I forget the name of it. Big Chinese tournament. huge. I mean, there were probably, I don't even know, maybe 30 schools there back in the days when, the tournaments were humongous.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been training, really hard, training really specifically around, specifically sparring training as opposed to fighting training. So, really like, learning the techniques and tricks of sparring. And I had really put a lot of effort into doing a kick where we call it a horse kick, but where, if I'm standing in a front stance, I swing around and kick blind with the back leg and sort of come straight out. And so I had sort of perfected that kick, and that was going to be my secret weapon. And I went out, and the fight started, and my opponent did that exact kick on me right as the bell rung and hit me directly in the solar plexus and knocked the wind out of me. So I got the very first move of my very first tournament. I got my ass kicked within 4 seconds. I was on the ground and couldn't breathe.
Man. Yeah, we in traditional Taekwondo we call that the back kick, and and I remember I was never a fan of it. And one black belt class, God, this was over 15 years ago. It was a Saturday black belt class, and my instructor said we were going to practice back kick. And he had everyone partner up, and we had to put one single glove on, and we had to hold our fist out, and our partner had to back kick. They could not look, and we had to go down and back. And at the time, our gym was, I know it was well over 100 feet. We had a long gym, and every time you missed, you had to do 10 push-ups. And I hated push-ups back then. I was the only black belt that didn't miss. I was like, there's no way I'm going to hit this target every time. There's no way I'm doing push-ups. It's like something inside of me just willed my foot to hit that target every single time. So, and I was never good at that kick, but it was like, I wanted to do it.
Yeah, it makes sense because without that precise targeting, that kick is useless, right? So
exactly.
That's really the whole point.
And that's probably the only time I've ever done that kick before.
It became I learned a bunch of variations of that kick, and it really became a tournament staple of mine, which was I was really good at pivoting and throwing the kick in a lot of different angles and going under somebody's guard and dropping people. So it ended up becoming a tournament winner for me over the years.
Nice. So now, did you ever compete in forms?
Yeah, we competed in forms as well. Yep.
Yeah. How was that for you? Was it better at fighting or equal in both?
I would say equal at both. It was sort of the same thing. So, when I got really serious in the tournament circle, so what had happened was I'd studied with this guy, Brian Gray, who I mentioned. And then I moved to New York City in the mid-90s. And I had the great fortune in 1996 of joining the Venerable Shi Ming's, the 34th generation Shaolin monk. He had opened his school in New York City just 2 years before. Okay. And he and Brian Gray knew each other. And so I sort of had an introduction and then joined his school and began training directly under him, where I trained for the next 3 years until 1999. Okay. And that the emphasis was really on really traditional Northern Shaolin forms. Okay. And then what happened was that, at that point I was, 29. I've been, training for a decade in Kung Fu and, 15 years in martial arts combined. And so I'd fought a lot. I was working as a bartender in Philly. I'd been in a lot of bar fights, breaking up fights. And so I was a little arrogant and had a chip on my shoulder. I was very confident. And I had a buddy. I moved from New York City to Philly, and I was commuting up to New York to train still with Shi Ming. And I had a buddy that said, hey, I was driving through Jenkintown, which is sort of like the Jewish section of northern Philly, which is right next to Koreatown. And he's like, there was a strip mall there, and I saw a sign for Shaolin Kung Fu, and you should check it out. And I was like, oh, that's ridiculous. Like strip mall Kung Fu in far northern Philly. Like, I'm studying under a Shaolin monk, from the temple. And so, but eventually it sort of gnawed on me. It wasn't very far from my home, and I was getting tired of the commute to New York. So I just decided to drop by one day. And so I walked by, and I guess it was a little before that. I was probably 28. And I walked by and looked through like the big plate glass window into the school. And there was a Asian man with his back to me who was doing a handless headstand. So he was just on the top of his head with his body completely straight and his arms at his side. Wow. And I thought, that's not Kung Fu, but that's pretty goddamn impressive that he has that kind of body control. Yeah. So I walked in, knocked on the door. And so he was a Korean master who had trained in just around Seoul, Korea in the 70s and earlier 80s under a Shaolin system that was run. It was actually a Jinwu system that was run by two Chinese masters that fled Mao Zedong and opened a school in the 50s. And they trained a guy named Master Kim in Korea, who then opened a Kung Fu school that my teacher trained in.
Wow.
So I come in, his English was very, very bad. He was tall for a Korean of his era, probably 5'10" and like a solid 180. He was a big dude for his time and place, and sort of a shaved head. And he was very humble, and I explained, all that I knew. And he said, "Oh, very good. You know more forms than me," sort of very humble. And he said, "So, show me some forms." And so I said, "Okay." So I did like 3 or 4 empty hand forms, and he watched. And afterwards, he said, "Oh, so no one ever teach you breathing?" And I said, "Breathing?" And he said, "No one ever teach you breathing?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Oh, well, no breathing? You like muscle man, very easy to beat." And which I took as like just a big, strong guy that lifts weights that someone like him could, dispatch quickly. So I thought, that's this guy's either arrogant or confident. And I don't know which. So I joined that school for a month. And in that month, I discovered that this guy, with all due respect to Shirya Ming, he was in a completely different league. Wow. I mean, he was the kind of master that I had read about and always wanted to meet and always wanted to train with. And so I left the school in New York City and joined his school. And then that became the path that I took. And that's now the lineage that I currently hold from him.
Wow. How long did you train directly at that school?
I trained directly at that school for about 6 years before I moved to Boulder, Colorado, where I am now, and then continued to train remotely with him up until about 2014 when he elevated me to a Shifu. After he saw my students give a performance for him.
Okay. Is he still with us? Do you still go back and train with him when you can? Or
so he ended up retiring, and
okay.
He's sort of one of those more old school masters, sort of more withdrawn and private. So we never had a strong personal relationship. The relationship was sort of always inside of the studio, and so he was a soft qigong master. So I had studied a lot of hard qigong, but he could do these demonstrations that were really mind-boggling. Like he would take 2 chairs and set them, about 5 feet 10 inches apart, about his height apart, and he would put the back of his head on one chair and then his heels on the other chair. So that is, he was holding his entire body straight just with his core strength.
Wow.
Now that's hard enough to do I would invite anybody listening to just try to do that alone.
No thanks.
It takes some strength.
Yeah.
And so he would do that, but then we would put a cinder block on his stomach and then put a towel on his face and then take a sledgehammer and bring the sledgehammer down full force onto the concrete, and it would shatter while we were taking photographs. And his body would never move even an inch when that happens. Wow. So he would do things like that. We would drive cars over his stomach as part of public demonstrations. He could break anything with his hands. And he was the most extraordinary fighter that I've ever seen in my entire life. No holds barred. I mean, what that guy could do, full speed, full contact, padded and helmeted sparring. But the things that he could do were just things that I've never seen to this day.
That's crazy. Wow.
And the stuff that I can't do, it's like, he showed me a lot of what he could do, but he was a bit of a savant. It would be like learning under like anyone who's just taken it almost beyond a human level.
So stuff you can't do yet is what you meant to say. Right?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I am still trying.
Well, that's good.
I definitely am, but. And he was, his English was very bad. And so, I had to really learn from him somatically. So, he used the old school training method, which, some of your listeners may be familiar with the more traditional Chinese way of teaching, which, traditional Chinese teacher, the metaphor is that if they're teaching a square, they'll show you one corner of the square. And when you figure out the second corner, then they'll show you the third corner. And then you have to figure out the fourth corner on your own.
Okay.
And so no one advances without figuring out what's being taught on your own, without asking questions. If you ask him too many questions, he would just freeze you out and not talk to you. And so it was that model where you show up and you train hard. And, you would see him watching you and you knew not to ask him anything. And when he felt you were ready, he would come up and he would offer corrections, or he would offer you new material. And then you could ask him a question. But, one question, two questions. And sometimes you would ask him these really elaborate, questions, like, okay, so master, am I breathing in from the dantian up into the chest and then running the energy down my arm as I'm stepping forward and throwing a punch and coming into a bow stance? And he would say, no. And that'd be it.
Wow.
And then you learned, I should probably ask simpler questions next time.
It's crazy and a little frustrating, I imagine, too.
It was, but it was also what I wanted, because it forced me, unlike an American teacher or one who was really trying to build the reputation of their school, he didn't give a shit. He taught people that were ready to learn. And if you weren't, you just, he would just let you sort of fade out of his school.
Okay. So now, did you try any other styles or systems before you moved to Colorado?
No, the other thing that was really interesting. So we had at that school, it's called the White Tiger Academy in Philadelphia. And so he had an open door policy, which was just brilliant. And so what that meant was that any school in Philadelphia, any martial arts school that wanted to come in and fight our school, they were welcome to do it. And so that translated into us fighting different schools, maybe 10 to 12 different schools a year, and full speed, full contact. And we fought American karate type schools, sort of fusion schools, a lot of Wing Chun schools, Bagua. It was a little before MMA had taken off. So we never had those guys. I didn't really become aware of that world until I'd come to Colorado in 2006. But it was phenomenal training, because Master John was like, he was like a scholar of martial arts. So we would know who was coming in, say, in 30 days. And then he would just train all of us to fight that style. And he would, if it was Wing Chun, he was like, this is what they do. This is how they attack. This is how they know how to breathe. This is how they breathe. And this is how you can most easily defeat that system. And he would do the same thing for every school that came in. So, if we were fighting a Wing Chun school, we were doing everything in a circular pattern. If we were fighting a Bagua school, we were doing everything in a linear pattern. And it made us very adaptive fighters. And as I said, I was bartending at the same time and breaking up basically in street fights. And so the combination of those two things, it really removed martial arts from an esoteric thing that you learn like a yoga, and really made it about, if you can't go toe to toe with another person, full speed and full contact, and hold your own, it taught me that there really isn't much point to training.
Makes a lot of sense. All right. So then what happened when you moved to Colorado?
I moved here, and it was tough being away from the school. The school ended up closing down. Master John had some personal things that came up for him. So I was sort of left on my own for a couple of years. And it was a very hard time for me, because I had been training long enough and with a high enough degree of skill that I knew I had more to learn. Like, I knew I was not anywhere near a Shifu level practitioner.
Right.
But I'd been taught so well that when I went around to the schools in this area, I did not find anybody who could train me still. And I also was unwilling to start over. So, you go into a lineage that's close but not the same, and they want you to do stances their way and strike their way.
Yeah.
And so I sort of bounced around, training on my own and feeling a little lost and frustrated, and like I'd been cut off from this amazing source of knowledge that I had access to for so long. And the thing I stumbled across to do was I knew that I was a good teacher and good at correcting my students. So I began to just record everything that I did on not long before, but a few years before smartphones. Mm-hmm. But I recorded on an old school, VHS camera. And then I would just look at myself practicing, and I could see the mistakes I was making. So I continued to try to evolve my practice by looking at my own practice as a student.
Okay. How long after you moved there did you actually start teaching other people?
Well, so when I was with Master Jian, I ran 9 classes a week at his school. So
okay.
I was, the Korean word is gyobom nim, and Chinese would be like dasi hing. But basically like older brother. So I was basically the school leader. So I ran 9 classes plus a sparring class. So I had a lot of mileage. I'd done that for 2 or 3 years before I left Philly. So I had some mileage under my belt as far as teaching large schools. So when I came out here, I floundered for about a year, and then people sort of found out that I had some martial arts under my belt, and a few people sort of convinced me to start teaching them a couple days a week, and that would have been probably 2007 or so. And then it just sort of started to take off from there. So I just started teaching, and more people were drawn into what I was doing, and I just basically reproduced as best I could the system and the culture that I had grown up in.
And then when did you officially open a school?
I officially opened the school, I basically was teaching sort of quietly up until I was made a Shifu in 2014. So I was a little conflicted because I'd been authorized to teach. I was an authorized instructor, but I did not hold a lineage. And so I was just a little uncomfortable in the position of wanting to hang my shingle and say that I was teaching at a school. But once I was made a Shifu, I sort of came out of the closet, if you will, and then opened the school and began teaching sort of more formally, and did that all the way up until the fall of this past year, 2023.
Okay. And so what was that process when was there like a test involved, or did he just say, hey, you're ready, I'm giving you this title? How did that come about with you becoming a Shifu?
Yeah. So he flew out here to give a couple day weekend seminar on Qigong and Tai Chi. And he stayed at my home. And so I knew that it might be on deck that he was going to test me to go through all of the material of the school, which, as you can imagine, there's a lot of material. And so I spent 6 months before he got here training, 7 days a week, doing everything, intensive cardio training, intensive Qigong practice, hard Qigong, really intensive soft Qigong practice, all these things. And then I prepped my students to be able to give him like an hour-long demonstration of as much of the lineage as I had taught them. So he led the tournament Friday night, all day Saturday, and then Saturday evening when it was done, I said, Master, I would like it if my students could give you a demonstration. And he said, oh yeah, sure. So about, I think I had 6 or 7 of my top people, and, the more beginner ones to the beginner forms. And we went up through, in our system, we had beginner, intermediate, advanced, what they used to call co-master, junior master, and then master levels. And so I trained my most senior people up through the advanced levels, and gave the demonstration. And he sat literally on the edge of his chair the entire time. He almost didn't blink. He just sat there with this expressionless face, took everything in. And then it ended, and he didn't make any comment. He just, we bowed and he left. And the next day he taught again. And being his student, I knew better than to ask him any questions about if there was going to be a test. He knew what my desire was, but I wasn't going to ask him. And he flew back to Philly. And there was basically, I kind of assumed that maybe he doesn't feel I'm ready. And then a few days later, he sent me a very short email that just said, I saw what your students did. The lineage has not changed or evolved or degraded at all in the way you've taught it. Your students have done a perfect reproduction of the lineage, and you are now a master. You're now a Shifu. I don't like to use the word master as it relates to me. I feel that's a different category beyond Shifu. Shifu is to me means authorized teacher. Mastery is something else. I still aspire to mastery.
That's pretty cool though. That'd be pretty cool to read that email. You obviously at that point you weren't expecting it.
Yeah, and of course, no certification in the mail, no plaque, no bouquet of flowers. It was just this like couple of lines, and then a bunch of stuff more about the lineage, and where it came from.
That's really cool. Think back to the very first class you taught for him to now. What do you think over those years? What do you think changed the most about your teaching style?
That's a great question. I mean, gosh, I was so young when I first started teaching, still in my 20s. So, I think back then it was Philly. Philly was a fighting city. It was Philly's a tough city. Everything back then was really oriented around application. Anything you learned was useless if it wasn't able to be unpacked and practiced with overt offense and defense in mind. In a street fight, which is, as you probably know, tournament fights last forever. Street fights, 7 to 10 seconds, right? It's right. Like they're real fast. And so in Philly, the emphasis was really on just these, it was tough guys, tough women, open door policy in the school, bar fights and street fights. And so it was really, the emphasis had a survival aspect to it. Like train as hard as you can. So if you have to use this, you take someone out quickly, savagely, and you end the fight. In 5 seconds, the fight is over. They are on the ground and you walk away if it gets to a fight.
Okay.
In Boulder, Boulder's like, it's like Bizarro World Philadelphia. It's like for those that know Superman, arcane Superman references, it's the opposite of Philadelphia. It's bucolic. It's safe. There's no underclass. It's everybody's educated, and all the government systems work, and there's very little crime. And so I think initially I was teaching in that really tough way, and now the emphasis is really on self-mastery. And I've come away from teaching as hard on the application and fighting sides. I save that for my most senior students. So really, if you've trained with me for 6 or 7 years, at that point here, that's when I begin to teach you how to really fight.
Okay.
Because like in Philly, you began to teach people how to fight on day one. But here I sort of save it for the people because it takes a lot of work and a lot of energy. And so, you sort of save it for the people that are in for the longer journey.
Nice. One thing I forgot to ask you, when you were competing, did you ever compete in weapons?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, I did, I did the bow, staff forms, and I did a broadsword and straight sword.
And which was your favorite weapon?
Broadsword.
Okay. So what led to the writing your first book? Is it writing something that you enjoyed as a young kid, or did that come just later in life? Or what kind of led to you writing your first book? And talk a little bit about the books you've written.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would say I had three cornerstones of my life. One was, obviously martial arts was one cornerstone. Another cornerstone was definitely a passion for writing. And a third one was meditation. But the writing thing was something I'd done since high school. I'd always wanted to be like a novelist, basically. And so my first book that got published was a collection of short stories that came out in 2009 under a British publisher. And a year or two went by, and then I had switched from training in Tibetan Buddhism, Vajrayana, to Zen. And I'd met this really iconoclastic and wild American Zen master named Dennis Kelly. And he and I got to be close and got to be friends, and I began to sort of informally train under him. And then he offered me his life story, which was just sort of like something out of an implausible Hollywood movie. And the story was just so fantastical and wonderful that my second book was a memoir of his life, just called A Heart Blown Open. And this guy, he was alcoholic, abusive home in Wisconsin, and ran away from his first family and ended up in the counterculture movement in the 60s, and then became one of the biggest manufacturers of LSD, providing LSD to like all the major 60s bands, something that was called Clear Light Window Pane, which was the best LSD that you could get. And then he was a fugitive, and then he was on the run. The DEA chased him for 5 years. He turned himself in. He served a year in a federal penitentiary, and then he turned to Zen and ended up spending 6 years in a Zen monastery. And then when he was 50, he started doing psychological shadow work, like things around trauma and attachment, and trying to figure out how the abuse of his childhood had shaped him. And even though he was a Zen Roshi, he realized that he was still, part of my French, but he was still a pretty fucked up guy. And so he started on this path of, deep spiritual practice, but also deep psychological self-inquiry, and ended up sort of creating a sort of novel approach to Zen and meditation. So that's what the next two books were about. That was Heart Blown Open, as I mentioned, his memoir. And then The Heart of Zen was the book that he and I wrote that was just sort of about his particular practice, which he called Mondo Zen, which is like an integration of emotional work and meditation work.
Cool. If someone wanted to, they've never read one of your books, which one would you recommend they try first?
Heart Blown Open is, people seem to love that one the most.
Okay.
It won a few awards. It did well. It was in the Hollywood machine for a little while with, talk about being made into a show or a movie or whatever. But, that seems like it's mostly talk.
Yeah. But that could change too. I've talked to others where that's, that was like that. And then it dropped off. And then 10 years later, hey, we want to pull this story out again. So you never know.
You never know. People come out, and I get inquiries from time to time, and, I always say, yeah, sure, let's talk about it. But, I'm not buying a second home, presuming that that's going to work out.
Probably a wise decision there.
Yeah.
So nice. Cool. And I will definitely, I'll put a link for your website and everything like that, so people can find your books. And what other stuff can they find if they go to your website?
Well, there's the stuff on the books. And then, I do a lot of my business these days is doing one-on-one coaching. So I work with people who are in, sort of developmental transitions, relationships, career, but just use a lot of the skills that I've learned over the years, somatic meditation, trauma, men's work, and just help people kind of get unstuck.
Like I said, I'll put the link out there, and if people want to contact you with questions and stuff, or I think you can just schedule, I think it has me right, they can just like schedule a call to discuss possibilities and stuff. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, like I said, I will definitely put that out there and promote that any way I can.
Great, Brian. Thanks.
With your background, it's a lot more, traditional style martial arts. And what are your thoughts on something like MMA and the UFC? You kind of mentioned it a little earlier. You didn't know a lot about it when you were first starting, but is that something you're a fan of? Do you watch it?
Oh yeah. Of course. I mean,
okay.
It's wonderful. I mean, to me, it's humbling to any traditional martial artist. I mean, the Gracie brothers and bringing in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I mean, back when I was training, you didn't fight on the ground. Ground fighting was for wrestlers and Western barbarians. It was not something that the Asians were particularly prone to doing. And there's a lot of really good historical reasons for that. Back when people were armed and there were no rules to fighting, ending up on the ground was a short way to get killed. So, and plus, often in China, people were fighting multiple opponents, bandits and things like that. So, techniques that would take one man to the ground and you with them would be ill-advised, to say the least.
Right.
And even as a bartender, as in my own practical experience, like breaking up bar fights, the last thing you want to do is end up on the ground ever, because the guy starts a fight and 4 of his buddies are with him. You just don't want to be on the ground in reach of their feet.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, but then watching, the tournament game, right? Tournaments are different. Sparring is different. It's not street fighting, and so it was very humbling realizing that I had no ground game and seeing what some of these really skillful practitioners could do to traditional martial artists, sort of twist them around. And, basically they get a hold of you and take you down. If you don't have a ground game, you're done. If there are no rules, it's a little different because you could go for the throat, you could go for the eyes, you could go for the groin. But in a tournament setting, without being able to grab the trachea or put your thumb in an eyeball, you're in big trouble.
Yeah.
So I began seeing that and was fascinated by it. And so I began doing some of my own cross training, Krav Maga and Muay Thai, just to learn different kinds of strikes, more vicious strikes than traditional martial arts offer. And then working on my ground game as well. I'm not proficient on the ground, but I wanted to get good enough to get off of the ground and to know what kind of takedowns I could expect, so I wouldn't get set up for an easy takedown. So as that's continued to grow and mature, to answer your question, my thought on the MMA, I think it's a beautiful system. I think it took a lot of things that traditional martial arts offered and condensed it into from a traditional mindset to a modern mindset, right? So it's so the emphasis, rather than on tradition and respect and lineage and doing what you're told and all this, the emphasis is more on accomplishment and winning and success and testing your skills in the ring. And those are beautiful things. I think it's obviously much more geared to younger people, and it has a much higher injury rate than traditional martial arts just by its nature. And the only downside that I see is that I don't see any interiority to what they offer. So, no internal qigong, not really mindfulness, no understanding of the inner energies of the bodies. It's a very Western reductionistic approach to martial arts, which is learn techniques from the outside in, condition your body, ground and pound, win at all costs kind of a thing. And that's just not how I teach, and that's not what I'm interested in. But I don't offer that as a critique of MMA, but just to say what I think traditional martial arts offers a contrast to.
No, I agree completely. So now, have you integrated some of those other stuff into your school?
So I closed my traditional school down in the fall because I realized that it wasn't working anymore. The traditional model of teaching, which is incomprehensibly large to most people today, there's so much to learn, and it requires years of dedicated study to be able to do anything. Like you're not any good until you've been training for 5 years, which is very different from MMA school, which you're going to be decent in 6 months, right?
Yeah.
And I began to see that I was drawing people over too broad of a spectrum. It was like older people that wanted the soft stuff but didn't want to do the hard stuff, and younger people that wanted the hard stuff but didn't want to do the soft stuff. And so everybody was sort of getting irritated. And I was noticing all my colleagues out here in Colorado, the traditional schools, whether they're Aikido schools or judo schools or Shogaton schools or even Taekwondo schools, right? Their attendance is plummeting because people can go to MMA schools and learn a lot quickly and not have to deal with all the traditional BS, I'm going to call it. So I came up with this idea called integrated martial arts, which I take the elements of traditional martial arts and I break them all apart. So it's more like if you think of going to a really good modern yoga school where you can learn like hatha yoga, vinyasa, bikram, yin, all these different kinds of yoga. You don't have to dedicate yourself to a single path. You can learn these different styles in the quest to better yourself. And if you really like it, you can always branch off and say, go, study hatha yoga with a hatha yoga teacher and take it all the way.
Okay.
And so the idea with this new school was that, I'm bringing in different practitioners from different lineages and offering far more classes. And so the idea is that the principles of traditional martial arts run through the whole school, but only people that want are going to be taught a whole system. Otherwise, you're going to learn all the things that you're going to learn in a good traditional school, obviously striking and kicking and breathing and qigong, but you're not going to have all the forms stacked on top of each other. You're not going to be forced to do things basically perfectly to advance. These things will be saved for people that would want to train with me sort of one-on-one directly under my lineage, which would be a different offer.
Okay. That's kind of a cool way to do it.
Yeah. And the idea would be like, let's say I have a judo practitioner that's teaching at my school 2 days a week, teaching basically, basic ground awareness and throwing. And the model, this IMA model it's collaborative. It's not competitive, right? So it's like, I'm not competing against the other traditional schools with this model. What I want to do is increase awareness of traditional martial arts so that if one of the people training at the IMA loves judo, then I want that judo teacher to take that student to their judo school, take them away from me and let them train fully in judo. Because I think if we don't start doing something like this, traditional martial arts are in danger of not surviving this next generation. I really believe that very concretely with what I'm seeing.
And I can see that. A lot of my guests have said, similar things, and which is weird because like in my area, I haven't seen that. Maybe it just hasn't gotten up here yet. Like, I trained at a traditional Taekwondo school, and there's times where we have 30 to 40 plus in a class.
Wow.
And he actually had to move to a bigger building a few years ago. And we had an adult class last summer on a Friday night in June. Usually a Friday night in the summer, no one's there. We had 38 students that night.
That's amazing. That's great.
Yeah, it was like 14 or 16 black belts, and the rest were color belts. Wow. And even he's like, I've never had a class this big, an adult class in the summer before. So yeah, I'm hoping maybe it'll miss our area and won't hit us, but it wouldn't surprise me if it did. So
yeah, because for me, like again, I have the utmost respect for MMA practitioners. I'm friends with a couple really, really advanced practitioners. Yeah, and it's not taking anything away from what they do, but the traditional path, especially the Chinese arts, offers so much beauty and complexity and so much potential for you to really learn so much about your interior spaces, your mindset, your inner chi, the quality of your heart, all these things that take years to cultivate and can produce unbelievable mastery, in some teachers that I've encountered that can do things again that seem like they're magical.
Right.
That's the 1% of the 1%, right? So, but for me, keeping alive these more esoteric elements is vital because these are the things that have actually helped keep my life on track through all these years, through all the ups and downs of life, divorce and death and all the things that come at us. And for me, having an external practice isn't enough. I need more than that to keep me on the path.
That makes perfect sense. So in all your years of martial arts, is there one philosophy you've learned that is at the top of your list?
Be kind.
Nice.
Yeah. When I'm sparring my students, I am very much in my heart. I don't mean to sound Boulder woo-woo here, but I don't dominate and I fight from a perspective of teaching. My master told me in 2014 when he made me a Shifu, he said, you can never get into a street fight ever again. He said, if you're defending someone, that's different. But if you get punched in the face, you now take the punch and you don't punch back. That's the deal.
Wow.
Which really surprised me. But I didn't understand it 10 years ago. But now as I'm cresting my fifth decade here, I understand the wisdom in what he was saying, right? It's you don't train for 30 years so you can go out and punch the homeless guy in the face that kicked your car or or break the guy's jaw at a bar that looked at your lady, or, some nonsense like that, right? It's like you've trained too long, you've developed too much power and control. It's not about that anymore.
All right. How about worst martial arts related injury?
I have been very, very, very fortunate. The worst thing that I've ever really done is, jam a finger, pull a hamstring, stuff like that.
Wow. You're very lucky.
Very lucky. I mean, I've had bloody noses and black eyes and bruised ribs and, all that kind of stuff. Right. And, but no broken bones. And, when we fought in tournaments, we wore the full caged helmet. So, okay. And they weren't required. They weren't bad, but we always wore them. And, we would always break other guys' noses. And we couldn't figure out why they wouldn't wear the same helmets that we were wearing.
Nice. That is cool.
So I've broken noses, but I've never had my own broken, and hoping to keep that record going for another 30 years if I can.
Never had my nose broken. I sprained ankles a few times. I broke a big toe and fractured a knuckle. That's pretty much it for me.
Big toe's a big deal though. That's not fun.
Yeah, exactly. But and I was trying to break a board and didn't pull my toes back far enough. That was completely my fault. But yeah. No, it's what's funny is my worst injury that affected my martial arts career my whole life is I when I was 16 playing kickball in gym class, I fell and my knee bent 45 degrees the wrong direction. I completely shattered and blew out my lateral meniscus and my ACL.
Oh my God, that's terrible.
Never had it rebuilt. And
oh my God.
No, I've been putting off that surgery for 30 years. So one of these days, and I say that as I'm like rubbing my knee because it's starting to bother me right now. And I know my orthopedic surgeon will be like, let's have a talk. We'll see. I'll keep putting it off.
And there's another like interesting bit with my teacher. Like, again, this idea of practical application, right? Like I wore combat boots back in those days. Like I always had a pair of like big combat boots. Mm-hmm. And, in Kung Fu, we train with shoes. We don't train barefoot. Yeah. And the idea there is that you're never going to get into a fight barefoot. So train with your shoes on.
Right.
And you obviously can't like pull your toes back when you're kicking with a pair of shoes on.
Yep.
So we kick with the top of the foot because there's a shoe there rather than the ball of the foot.
That makes sense.
But Master John would have me come in and train in my combat boots because not do the forms, but to fight in them, because he said, this is what you're going to fight in. If you get into a fight, wear the shoes that you're going to use because you have to know how to use them offensively.
Yeah.
There's no point to using like a thin Chinese shoe and then putting on a huge combat boot and then trying to adapt that. Go ahead, just fight in the big boot.
Yep.
Which is awesome. How many teachers think to tell their students that?
Yeah. Yeah, I know when I used to teach long ago, when I used to teach self-defense, I would do that. I would train them in their tennis shoes and stuff.
Yeah.
And street clothes. So it makes sense.
Unless you're a lifeguard.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, David Hasselhoff knew how to fight barefoot, I'm telling you. Nice. All right, I had a few fun questions to wrap up the interview.
All right.
Who are 3, 4, 5 names you would put on your personal Mount Rushmore of martial arts?
Oh, man. Probably no one that you would know. Of course, my teacher, Jong Hoon Jeon. Mm-hmm. He would be at the very top for me. My own teacher, just one of a kind. I would put another unknown guy named Bing Lee, Binglee, Bing Lee, who's a mid-70s. He's a Chen style Tai Chi teacher out here. And he is an unmitigated badass. I mean, he can do things with his body. He can throw energy. He can put his fingers on you and knock you back 10 feet. It's just incredible. He's an incredible practitioner.
Nice.
I would put Shifu Howie Solo, who's a master in the Hung Mei lineage, which is sort of a northern and southern style. He runs a very traditional school out here in Colorado. He is a principled, disciplined, generous man. He's been a mentor to me. And he's also an extraordinary practitioner. He's dedicated his entire life to training and nothing but training, and have the utmost respect for him.
Nice.
I would probably put Shi Ming up there as well. I mean, Shi Ming, he's a little bit of a hotshot, or at least he was. But again, the things I saw that he could do, and his devotion and dedication to keeping this beautiful thing alive and keeping it vital, and vicious and beautiful.
Nice. All right. We talked a little bit about MMA. What would your MMA walk-up music be? If you were fighting, what song would play as you're walking into the cage?
Oh gosh, it would have to be something from Nine Inch Nails. I'm probably, I think it's Just As You Imagined.
Nice.
It was in the trailer for 300, but the good Nine Inch Nails instrumental song would be it for me.
Very cool. All right, you're the first one to pick Nine Inch Nails, I think. So that's good. That's good. All right, how about a favorite martial arts book?
I have to come clean here, Brian. I haven't really read any martial arts book. That's not
really.
I mean, I write books and I read a ton of books, but I've tried to read a few, and I've learned better for me to sit in front of a living master and soak it in.
Not even any like martial arts biographies you've read or anything that you enjoyed, or
nothing that really comes to mind. No.
Okay, cool. Yeah, not a problem. All right, how about then? I'm hoping you have an answer for this one. Favorite martial arts video game? Did you ever get into video games?
I did not.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Wow. 0 for 2. Okay. All right. How about a favorite martial arts TV show?
I would have to say, you probably get this one a lot, but I have to say, I think the Cobra Kai show, they just killed it. I mean, they just, I watched that show with a huge smile on my face, just start to finish.
Yep.
Funny, a great homage to the 80s and just to the whole culture of karate that I grew up in, and silly and just fantastic. Yeah.
I agree. I watch it with my daughter, and I'm about to start rewatching since the new episodes will be out in July. So I'm gonna have to start rewatching it soon.
I'm very excited. Season 5, I think. Was that right?
5 or is it 6? It's the final season, and it's final season, but it's coming in 3 parts, which I'm not happy about.
Oh, they're gonna tease us with it.
Yeah, I think it's gonna be like 6. I think it's 18 episodes. So I think it's 6, 6, and 6. 6 in July, 6 in December, and then not the rest aren't until like next April or May.
Gotcha. So, why, a quick aside on that show, I was watching it and I forget the guy, the sort of silvered hair guy.
Terry Silver.
Yeah. Silver. Right. Yeah. But like in one of the scenes with him, right, there are 2 things that struck me about him. One, he did a spinning kick and kicked a bottle of water off the table.
Yep.
And I was like, that actor just did that. That was not a stand-in. So I quickly Googled him and I was like, oh, he's like a highly trained martial artist.
Yeah. Awesome. Thomas Ian Griffith. He's a fifth degree black belt now, I believe.
Yeah. And the other thing that I love about him, and he's supposed to be like an evil guy, but you look at his eyes and he has like the kindest, warmest eyes, so I love the contrast of like, he's supposed to be a bad guy, but every time I look in his eyes, I'm like, that guy's got a good heart.
Yeah. I know after Karate Kid 3, he tried kind of being like the action type hero, and he made a few decent martial arts movies, but he didn't really pick up like I think he probably should have, because he's talented. He's really talented.
Yeah. And what's so great about that show is it gave so many of those actors another lease on life, which is just great.
100%. Yeah. And I've been lucky. I've had 3 or 4 people connected with the Karate Kid universe on my show now. So
cool.
Yeah. A couple that have been on Cobra Kai and a few that were in the original Karate Kid movies. And he's on my list. I want to get Thomas Ian Griffith on here. He'd be fun to talk to. So fingers crossed. All right. How about a favorite martial arts movie?
Those I'm better at. I mean, there's a lot. I mean, the IP Man ones were great.
Yep.
Or the Ip Man, Ip Man.
Yep.
Sorry, it's later in the day here. I'm a little tired.
Oh yeah.
Yes, the Ip Man. I'm thinking of IT. I have an IT problem that I have to face when I get off this call.
Don't call me.
Those were great. I enjoyed Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon a lot when that came out, and a lot of the movies that came out of that, from that sort of genre, that those directors and sort of that world. I love the what was the one that was the Thai martial artist that had a bunch of long shots?
Ong Bak.
Umbach. I love that.
Tony Jaa. Yep.
Yeah, that was really good. I mean, like, there are a bunch of them I like. Like, I've pretty much seen. I thought Man of Tai Chi was really good with
Keanu Reeves. That was a good movie.
Keanu Reeves and his teacher Tiger Chen. That one was good. But yeah, I mean, those I can watch all day long.
That's cool. Yeah, if I'm bored, I'll pop on. I mean, I tell this a lot of my guests. I have a handful of like martial arts movies that I watch at least once a year, and it's Karate Kid, Best of the Best, Only the Strong, Bloodsport. I mean, those all at least once a year. I'll dig them out and watch them. No matter.
Yep.
Then there's other ones that aren't martial arts. Like I'll do war games. I'll do Star Wars. I'll do things like that. But
totally,
that's awesome. And one of my all-time favorites, Pump Up the Volume.
Pump Up the Volume. Yeah.
Christian Slater. Just watched it about 3 months ago. So.
Well, and I know it's funny. I just watched the movie Heathers with John Cusack, and I forgot that Cusack is like a really capable kickboxer. And
you mean
say
anything?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And towards the end of that movie, there's a really good fight scene in a hallway. And I was watching it, the same thing. And I was like, wait a minute, he's trained. So I look it up and it turns out he's been doing
Benny the
kickboxing
Jet
his entire life. Yeah. So and I would be remiss if I didn't say the John Wick movies, even though that's really sort of gung fu, not kung fu. It's still fantastic.
Definitely. All right. Final question. Any movie you've ever seen, doesn't have to be martial arts movie, favorite movie fight scene?
Well, I could tell you my least favorite one, but let me think about
what's that? I'm curious. What's that one?
Least favorite one would be the fight between Yoda and Christopher Lee. I can't remember who the actor was.
Yeah.
The actor is Christopher Lee. Darth Sidious or whatever his name was.
Yep.
I don't know what his name was. But where Yoda was hopping around like a Mexican jumping
CGI, yeah.
Oh, it was just, it's like, and anyone that's trained in martial arts, like the old masters don't move much. That's the whole thing. They like, you get close to them and they put their pinky on you and your bones crumble. So that was ridiculous. Best fight scene. Boy, I enjoyed a lot of the choreography in the Daredevil Netflix Marvel thing that came out a few years back with Charlie somebody or another.
Yeah, that was a phenomenal series.
But the fight scenes had that grit and, they felt they were shot in a way that was very convincingly real.
Yep.
But a movie, let me think, movie fight scene. I might have to just give a shout out to Philly and say, it's got to be Rocky and Apollo Creed. It's got to be that.
Nice. I love it. And I've only been to Philly once. Yeah, I was there for work like 20 years ago, and they promised me they'd bring me to the museum so I could run up the steps, and they never did. I was so mad. It's the one thing I wanted to do when I was in Philadelphia.
What's funny is the statue of Rocky, which was in the movies. Yep. That it was just a prop. It's not like a real work of art. Yeah. But everybody wanted to see it, and so they finally relented and mounted it. It's basically to the right of the museum when you go up. It's basically right up front. Yeah. So which is really funny that the Philadelphia Museum of Art has a movie prop in front of it.
That's what I want to go there, and then I want to go to Seattle to visit Bruce Lee's grave. Those are like the two on the opposite coast. I want to go to both those places.
Yeah.
And pay tribute to movies that changed my life and stuff. But cool. Well, before I let you go, is there anything maybe I forgot to ask you, or is there anything you want to get out there really quick before we wrap it up?
No, I think we've covered enough territory, Brian. I appreciate the opportunity to run my mouth so much. Hey,
it's been fun. Like I said, we've been planning it for a while, and I think it was worth the wait. And I think the listeners are really going to enjoy it.
Awesome, man. Well, again, I appreciate your persistence, and it's a great honor to be on here and talk to you and be in the company of some of the people that you've had on the show. So I really do appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Everyday Martial Artist. We hope you will join us every week for a brand new episode with a different martial artist telling their story. If you enjoy the show, be sure to leave us a review. Also, be sure to check out our website at everydaymartialartist.com. There you can find all of our episodes and contact us to suggest guests and ask questions. Again, thanks for listening to Everyday Martial Artist, and we'll see you next week.